Good afternoon. Thank you for joining me again for the reading of the 8th chapter of my book, Understanding an Afrocentric Worldview, Introduction to an Optimal Psychology. I am Dr. Linda James Myers, its author. It was published in 1988 and again revised in 1993, but I think you'll find the information still quite relevant today. Today's chapter 8, is Therapeutic Process for a New Age, Belief Systems Analysis. If Heidegger is correct in his analyses, then some serious steps must be taken to change the course of the West and the world. This chapter is devoted to a discussion of a therapeutic process I call belief systems analysis, which helps people change to an optimal conceptual system so that ultimately their experiences also change. Heidegger proposes that nihilism has been the fundamental movement of the West. He states that it shows such great profundity that its unfolding can have nothing but world catastrophes as its consequence. Those who fancy themselves free of nihilism are those who perhaps most fundamentally push forward its development. Orthodox Western psychology has recognized the importance of cognition in behavior. However, typical cognitive behavioral approaches have fallen short of delineating an optimal conceptual system. Ellis, a leading thinker in cognitive therapies, has moved to the position that it is impossible to achieve consistently good mental health. Given the limitations of the suboptimal conceptual system, Ellis's findings are probably correct. It is through the optimal conceptual system that health is gained and maintained. Based on our analyses of the suboptimal worldview, we can provide a solution through an optimal psychology and its corollary belief systems analysis. Belief systems analysis, the practice. Belief systems analysis is a cognitive therapy in the sense that is very much concerned with the act or process of knowing, including awareness and judgment. Holistic in orientation, belief systems analysis does not separate the cognitive from the unconscious, the affective, behavioral, optimal, cultural, feminine, or the metaphysical. It differs, however, from other cognitive therapies in two significant ways. Belief systems analysis is an Afrocentric model of psychological functioning, and it specifies the conceptual system of the worldview or reality the therapist wishes the client to create for their health and sustainable well-being. It does not tell them what to think, but it does suggest how they might best order their thinking. The aim is to teach the client a method of viewing the world within which he or she can achieve maximal positivity and experience, that is, everlasting peace and happiness as known to the ancients. The model may also be described as a Black feminist metapsychology. Black symbolizes the absorption of all of the colors of the spectrum, all of the energies into one. Feminist refers to the resurgence of the feminine spiritual principles held by the primordial mother, and to metapsychology, which explores the role of the human mind in the cosmos. The first phase of belief systems analysis therapy is a therapist examination of the client's belief system vis-a-vis the optimal conceptual system, and an assessment of how much change the client desires to make. The therapist will explore the presenting problems in terms of their underlying assumptions or conceptual framework for a thorough understanding of their utility and efficacy, evidenced by the client's personal history, goals, and consciousness. Our underlying premise is that ultimately everyone seeks everlasting peace and happiness. Not knowing that an optimal state is achievable, not knowing how to achieve it, not understanding the requisite structures for its existence, These are some of the difficulties belief systems analysis is designed to overcome. By comparing and contrasting the consequences of differing belief systems analysis, or I will refer to from now on BSA, introduces the alternatives that lead to spiritual growth gradually. This places the client in the position of making conscious choices and taking responsibility for them. Throughout the process, the client's search for self-knowledge must be purposeful. The desire for the search must come from within. Self-knowledge is the basis of all knowledge. In the Afrocentric paradigm, as we've come to know our identity as God manifesting, we rely more and more on our inner knowledge. The client begins to experience therapy as a more supportive, reinforcing, clarifying, and less didactic experience. Also, experiential knowledge the client is internalizing begins to surface. The client may become more relaxed, enthusiastic, loving, and so on. Self-knowledge is the basis of all knowledge in the Afrocentric paradigm. And we do come to know ourselves as God manifesting as we rely more and more on our inner knowledge. Most commonly, the client's changes will manifest through 1, self-esteem. Self-worth is no longer based on external criteria, and the client is no longer concerned about what other people think. 2, health and resourcefulness. The client ceases to know his or her feelings to be defined as reactions to circumstances and is thus empowered to define reality. 3, prosperity and self-determination. The client identifies with and adopts as his/her own the desires of infinite spirit as source and supply, relying on faith, experiencing patience, and trust. The realization of being a manifestation of an infinite positive power is the outcome of the process of developing an optimal conceptual system. Within this framework, power is the ability to define reality. Like other cognitive therapies, BSA emphasizes rational thinking, but unlike them, BSA utilizes a transcendent system of reasoning, diunital logic, rooted in specific cultural and historical context. As you will recall, diunital logic is the logic that yields both and conclusions, rather than the dichotomous logic, which yields either or conclusions, characteristic of the suboptimal cultural worldview. While the value of transcendent belief systems has been noted, it is imperative that the active ingredients of BSA be translated to fit within the language and belief structure of the client. This facilitates openness and honesty in exploring and articulating our beliefs and in discovering how they affect us. The client need not be exposed to the whole paradigm. The therapist may rely on his or her own creativity to outline for the client what life might be like according to the worldview we define as optimal. As with all therapies, the choice to change belongs to the client. For additional support and encouragement, a group therapy setting may be ideal. Belief systems analysis crosses the barriers of world religions and other consciousness disciplines. The teachings of Jesus the Christ, Buddha, Muhammad, and other sages and prophets of all time converge in the spiritual truths of the optimal conceptual system, which generates, as a consequence, the Christ, in quotes, consciousness. Christ meaning conscious union with the divine within oneself. The Bible, Quran, and other ancient books of wisdom and most Eastern philosophies can be useful tools in belief systems analysis therapy, connecting with beliefs of the client. For the African American population, it is often helpful to point out that this optimal conceptual system allowed our ancestors to survive almost 400 years of chattel caste enslavement. As the BSA therapy process raises levels of consciousness, clients will assume their unity with the source of all good and know that they themselves are expressions of that good. Security and well-being can finally be realized without the stress and strain put upon by the material, the external. Asapau and Wash identify at least 4 ways in which theory may be useful in counseling sessions. 1, assisting treatment strategies and planning. 2, understanding human behavior or client behavior. 3, suggesting certain techniques. And 4, identifying goals and objectives to be pursued for client benefit and evaluation. These can be applied to belief systems analysis. Strategies and planning. Belief systems analysis is a tool that can be used to develop clients' capabilities for self-healing and sustained development toward full potential. BSA is to improve the quality of the client's life by helping him or her structure it in a maximally positive view of the world. At the same time, more conventional concerns such as symptom relief, behavior change provide practical lessons throughout the edification process. Questions related to identity, perhaps of being, the role of consciousness, human nature, responsibility, and other more specific questions about conceptual system change must be thoroughly explored. When the client chooses the belief system that for him or her is true, the choice whether or not to change and to what degree, the role of the therapist is to ensure that the client clearly understands the consequences of that choice. All belief systems are in part constructs of rewards and punishment. So also is the client's adopted belief system. The therapist must assume a supportive role that inspires the client's understanding that everything is in divine order at all times and all places. To accomplish this, the therapist's worldview must be based on an optimal conceptual system. Modeling is an important aspect of the therapeutic process of belief systems analysis. At the same time, the therapist must have the ability to engage in the client's belief system in order to communicate the benefits of change. The therapist must also evolve with the client, affirming the difficulty in the transition the client has courageous. Edit, please. The therapist must also evolve with the client, affirming the difficulty in the transition the client has courageously chosen and understanding the common context the client and therapist share. Understanding human behavior. Because we are so deeply entrenched in the suboptimal, everyone may not be ready to adopt an optimal conceptual system. This awareness need not be troublesome because it too is in order. What we must understand is that within the client, a sense of individual ego and identity is literally fighting for its life. The client will feel insecure, threatened, and may even be defensive. While these feelings may be masked with great bravado, the client is afraid to get off such a treadmill as has been his socialization for his lifetime. The idea of the unknown may be overwhelming if we cannot see, touch, taste, hear, and smell. That is claimed familiarity, the limitation of the materialist ontology, what we seek to know. We simply deem it unknowable and too impractical for our efforts. After all, a treadmill is familiar. Part of this sense of individual ego and identity will implore the client's separation, pull the client away from the process of self-knowledge. At a subconscious level, the client may believe it is not good enough or is undeserving of identification with the supreme reality. The self that is separate from God creates false desires, affirming self-worth from material and external things. False desires breed false activities or maneuvers to gain recognition and importance, false problems, and false suffering. Suggested techniques. The client should be encouraged to become a critical thinker, to question and challenge assumptions, to make holistic analyses. These practices will facilitate getting in touch with the spirituality of his or her being. When inner awareness is ignited, the client becomes able to use all experiences as a mechanism for growth. Self-monitoring of thoughts and feelings with an observer's detachment, meditation, and practicing in daily activities, the conscious awareness of union with God are beneficial techniques. In addition, hypnosis, dream analysis, relaxation exercises, biofeedback training, astrology, and other activities may be useful in increasing self-knowledge. Readings in ancient history, African religion, metaphysics, human potential, and other areas of transpersonal literature can also be helpful, as well as observing and analyzing popular culture in an effort to increase self-awareness and human understanding. Goals and objectives. The goal of belief systems analysis is to improve quality of life by raising consciousness to the level of the optimal. Life forces are revered as God-given and inseparable from God. Harmony among all life forces is our aim. We begin with self-love and work outwards. When we feel good about ourselves, we feel better about others. This becomes the criteria of goal achievement and evaluation. Remembering the axiology and process of intuology in Afrocentric theory, belief systems analysis seeks to bring about our experiential realization that all things are connected through human and spiritual networks. Belief systems analysis and other therapies. Belief systems analysis is hardly exclusionary of other psychotherapeutic approaches. In most instances, it enlarges and enhances their basic premises and provides a unifying framework for their comprehensive dispensation. Through cognitive restructuring, fostering a resurgence of Afrocentrism and respect for the Black mindset and model functioning, we can expect from belief systems analysis the convergence and synthesis of ancient wisdom and contemporary thinking. Through a brief discussion of issues and a comparison of their dispositions according to belief systems analysis and other therapeutic approaches, we shall better understand the dynamic balance. Transpersonal therapies. Belief systems analysis falls within a category of transpersonal psychotherapy, the fourth force in psychology foreseen by Maslow. Because of its cultural rootedness and historical perspective, however, there are some differences in the specificity of BSA's application and techniques. As do other transpersonal models, BSA delegates to consciousness the basis and content of all experience. Thus, we live more in bondage to our conditioning than we sometimes realize. BSA makes freedom from conditioning possible. It goes even further in specifying a method through which the most rudimentary aspects of negative conditioning can be eradicated at a deep level, at the level of the conceptual system. BSA assigns to personality a more purposeful role than other transpersonal models suggest. Personality is used here in the sense of traits describing relatively enduring differences among people and specifiable tendencies to perceive the world in a certain way, and in dispositions to react and behave in a special manner with predictable regularity. This definition is consistent with emphasis on our model on conceptual systems as the structures underlying the worldview and behavior. Thus, personality traits expressly evidence conceptual systems along their continuum from suboptimal to the optimal. As such, perceptual tendencies and dispositions to react can be comprehended and predicted with greater accuracy and depth of meaning. Afrocentric psychology views personality as purposeful in its emergence, harmonious with its ecology, and consistent with the laws of life. Belief systems analysis emphasizes that personality, like history, is a testament of spirit manifesting through human and spiritual networks, and that the study of personality can contribute to edification. In their transpersonal model, Walsh and Vaughan suggest that personality is not, nor is it like to be, identified with personal drama. Belief systems analysis encourages examination of, but not identification with, personality, unless and until the individual's conceptual system has been elevated to the optimal. Only through the optimal conceptual system is true personality revealed. Identification in the process by which something is experienced as self. The tendency of the suboptimal conceptual functioning is to identify with objects, external criteria, thoughts, feelings, and so on. This is a process of bondage and must be avoided. The optimal conceptual system takes us beyond false identity through diunital logic, offering a rational method for pure awareness and enlightenment. The psychoanalytic techniques of objective, non-judgmental attitude and interpretation of free associations and the transference phenomena can be understood and implied within the context of belief systems analysis. In addition, the working through or resolution of transferred thoughts and feelings is a treatment goal of belief systems analysis, and the therapy is structured to work through debilitating thoughts and feelings as the client expresses them. Existential approaches. Existential approaches have several aspects in common, namely that people are conscious of themselves, able to make decisions, and are responsible for their actions. While external influences such as heredity and environment may be limiting, they are not determinative. Achievement reflects personal choice. An individual's awareness is enhanced by the integration of the biological world, excluding self-awareness, the world of the interrelationships, psychological world, and the world of self-identity, or spiritual world. Because we are in constant state of becoming, the idea of non-being, or death, adds meaning to life and at the same time becomes a source of anxiety, hostility, and sometimes aggression. The aim of the existential approach is to help us increase our commitment to life, self-awareness, and authentic existence. To accomplish this, emphasis often focuses on the common experiences of loneliness, isolation, depersonalization, and detachment. Belief systems analysis and existential approaches converge through their interest in the meaning and purpose of life and the role and responsibility of the individual. However, BSA emphasizes the understanding that suffering, anxiety, and fear of death are normal, in quotes, only in the sense that most of us in the West have internalized the suboptimal conceptual system that produces such feelings as its natural consequences of expression. BSA is structured to give more specific directions for overcoming the weaknesses of that faulty conceptual system. In logotherapy, Frankl, an existentialist, emphasizes the spiritual dimension. However, Frankl is less clear and specific and less hopeful of helping people consciously accept responsibility for themselves and their actions. In addition to the techniques of free association, interpretation, suggestion, reasoning, convincing, persuasion, and teaching, Frankl uses the paradoxical intention and deflection. In paradoxical intention, the client is encouraged to expose him or herself to the feared or fear-producing situation absent the expectation that the fear will occur as a response. In deflection, the client is encouraged to ignore problems, instead direct his or her attention to something pleasant and favorable. While these techniques are acceptable in belief systems analysis, we shall further optimize our experience by exploring how to achieve the greatest positivity in experience. At the same time, the relationship between the client and therapist is more important than any method or technique. Perceptual phenomenological approaches. Among the most important perceptual phenomenological approaches is Rogers' client-centered therapy. In client-centered therapy, reality is considered a matter of individual perception. Subjective and personal data are valid sources of information. Rogers emphasizes congruence, interpreted as psychological adjustment, among self-concept, awareness, experience, and communication. He determined that the therapist's disposition of positive regard toward the client promotes conditions of worth, that is, standards of thought and behavior that permit a person to like self and be liked by others. The effects of positive regard evidence that the growth potential of any individual is best nurtured and realized in a relationship in which the therapist communicates acceptance, genuineness, and understanding. The aim of the client-centered approach is to create a supportive, non-punitive situation and empathetic understanding of the client's internal frame of reference. Accordingly, the client is freely allowed to explore and express thoughts and feelings that will help them develop positive self-esteem and resolve incongruence. Belief systems analysis agrees with this approach and shares its client regard, but promotes a more active role of the therapist in helping the client establish for him or herself optimal conditions of worth. Rational therapies. In many ways, BSA can be described as a preferential rational emotive psychotherapy, in that it aims to cure unreason, the suboptimal conceptual system, through reason, the optimal conceptual system. However, a cognitive teaching relationship that focuses on the identification of intellectual problem-solving responses, thus minimizing emotional feeling-oriented responses, is not characteristic of belief systems analysis. So while the two approaches converge on some basic assumptions about emotional disturbance or unhappiness as a function of irrational and illogical thinking, BSA is more holistic in its dispensation of that awareness. By examining the client's conceptual system and the ways in which it generates specific debilitating feelings, the client is able to move beyond his or her insistence that some event, behavior, or attitude of another person should or must be different from the way it is, or from an irrational belief. The model used by Ellis has its major goals as the reduction of the client's self-defeating view and acceptance of a more realistic, tolerant, and rational philosophy of life based on the Western worldview. BSA transcends the Western worldview to engage reality, tolerance, and rationality at another level. Again, the techniques such as logic, reasoning, suggestion, confrontation, commands, indoctrination, prescriptive behavior, role-playing, assertiveness training, desensitization, humor, support, and even homework may play a role in belief systems analysis. But under most circumstances, the usefulness of abrasive techniques must be minimal. Behavioristic approaches. The aim of the behavioral approach is to help people acquire adaptive behavioral responses and eliminate maladaptive responses, so that more effective and less self-defeating behavior will result. Behavior modification is based upon the concept of determinism. The client is viewed as possessing a collection of previously reinforced responses that were and can be utilized in new circumstances or situations. Thus, behavior, a product of antecedent conditions, nullifies free will. While verification of behavior and the measurement of change are valued in belief systems analysis, techniques to change behavior that do not emphasize cognition are ordinarily not used. Edit, please. While verification of behavior and the measurement of change are valued in belief systems analysis, techniques to change behavior that do not emphasize cognition are not ordinarily used. Social psychological approaches. From a social psychological perspective, psychotherapy is viewed as a social influence process. The environment is determinative of behavior, but to some extent, a person is capable of controlling the environment. More effective social behavior relies on improving environmental control, which leads to more self-control. According to this approach, self-control assists the individual in regulating affect, cognition, and actions. The perceived credibility and attractiveness of the therapist influences the client's ability to alter his or her control. The role of the therapist is to identify psychological inconsistencies for the client and introduce different standards for evaluating experiences and behavior in order to help the client process information and attribute behavior to causes that are more controllable. From the social psychological perspective, discrepant and credible information presented to the client can effect change and facilitate self-control. We may conclude that what the social psychological approach proposes as the main thrust of therapy, belief system analysis treats as a natural consequence of the process. Increased self-knowledge is emphasized as a means to increase self-control. Optimal thought and daily experience. Inherent in the worldview of the optimal conceptual system is a clear ethical standard and a belief that a naturally ordered universe exists. As Akbar so aptly states, at all levels of life, one pervading definitive motif is the tendency that life forms have to preserve and perpetuate themselves. That consciousness, the largest life system, source of creation, perpetuates itself through the optimal conceptual system, and that optimal conceptual system maximally ensures everlasting peace and happiness are empirical considerations best addressed through subjective experience. Having analyzed the psychology of Black expressiveness, Pasteur and Tolson provide the following suggestions for realizing and maintaining the Afrocentric identity of oneness with nature, a prerequisite for healthy living. Cultivate relationships with elements in the natural world. 2, access knowledge of holistic medicine. 3, resist realizing and standardizing existence. Guard against repetitive routines of doing the same old thing the same old way. Do some things when you feel like doing them and negotiate for freedom from time compulsion. Be as frank, honest, and to the point as possible. Move as naturally, relaxed, and rhythmically as possible. Love life and self, wishing to see self multiply. In terms of our general orientation to living, Pasteur and Tolson advise that we first ask, is it natural? According to the spiritual material ontology, consciousness is the primary factor of the universe. Schwartz de Lubitz observes that according to ancient Egyptian thought, the universe is consciousness only and represents the evolution of consciousness from beginning to end, the end being a return to its cause. In other words, consciousness evolves toward psychological consciousness, which is conscious of innate consciousness. This is the first step in liberating consciousness from physical contingencies, according to the spiritual material ontology, as a result of the primary of consciousness. Deification of consciousness is at once the result and catalyst of unification. When an individual accepts divine consciousness as reality, he or she has found their true identity as God manifested. From the optimal perspective, the upper reaches or last stages of nigrescence, the process of becoming black and developing a positive identity, according to Cross, can be worked through in the belief systems analysis psychotherapeutic model. Utilizing the Thomas model, the fifth stage is transcendence or transcendental. Through one's unique blackness, difficulties about race, age, sex, and social class disappear, and one sees self as a part of humanity in all its manifestations. This last stage of the Cross model requires inner security and satisfaction with self, love and compassion for all oppressed people, and commitment to improving quality of life for the group. In both models, tension and defensiveness about one's identity are gone. Because basic universal truths are identified in the optimal conceptual system, aspects of these truths are prevalent elsewhere. The process of self-understanding through a suboptimal worldview crosses race, culture, sex, class, and so on. In ordinary life in the United States, we are not always aware of the unity of all things, and so we divide the world into separate people, objects, and events. Western culture assumes this division useful and necessary. However, as we know, it's not fundamentally a feature of reality. To cope with the categorization of the everyday environment. Edit, please. Western culture assumes this division useful and necessary. However, as we know, it's not a fundamental feature of reality. To cope with the everyday environment, this division is an abstraction created by our discriminating and categorizing intellectual orientation. When we think symbolically, that is, from a generic universal frame of reference, we see that Akbar's category of mental disorder among African Americans can be applied to all people who are being oppressed by a suboptimal worldview. Noted psychologist Naim Akbar describes 4 categories of mental disorder among African Americans that result as a consequence of being disenfranchised from our optimal worldview, thus manifesting a false sense of self. In this first category, the alien self disorder, individuals see themselves as material and the basis of their worth as contingent upon material accoutrements. Having assimilated the suboptimal worldview that denies cultural, historical context of evolution in contemporary society, they have become alienated from themselves. Affectation best describes the demeanor of persons who suffer from this order. Sexual problems and perversions are also common. The next category of disorder, the anti-self disorder, compounds the problem of the alien self disorder through overt and covert hostility against one's ancestral origin and by implication against oneself. According to Akbar, individuals who have this disorder are motivated by a personal self-interest, using the approval of the dominant white group as the main influence on their behavior. According to the standards of democratic sanity that exist in our society, they are likely to be looked upon as models of mental health. Democratic sanity is sanity ascribed by the society by virtue of the fact that most people do or do not engage in a thing or in an act. Akbar notes that as the apex of rejection, many choose a marriage partner from the dominant group, thus reinforcing their inferiority. To attain the status of acceptability by the dominant group, some individuals become even more aggressive toward their group of origin, and their isolation intensifies. People who have an anti-self disorder are particularly susceptible to being manipulated by the dominant group into suppressing the progress of the African American community. The last category I shall discuss, and this is the self-destructive disorder that results from the most direct and overt oppression. Akbar states that self-destructive disorders represent self-defeating attempts to survive in a society that systematically frustrates normal efforts toward and out of urgency for survival, select personally and socially destructive means to alleviate immediate wants. Included in this category are pimps, pushers, prostitutes, substance abusers, and psychotics. The cumulative consequence of long-term exposure to pathology leads to Akbar's fourth category, organic disorder. As we review such problems and substance as As we review such problems as substance abuse, we can now identify the dynamics of how we are set up, in quotes, and reinforced to carry out such behavior. Considering that our system of self-worth causes self-worthlessness, and that our society suggests that for every problem we have, there is something we can take for it, should we be surprised at the complexity of problems we face? On the contrary, if we are not addicted to something in an addictive society, we would be surprised, or we should be surprised. As we have seen through its optimal conceptual system, the Afrocentric worldview provides the foundation for the examination of all belief systems. The juxtaposition of the worldview, beliefs, and values forms the structure of a new and relevant psychotherapy. Belief systems analysis through BSA and Afrocentric worldview is achievable. The optimal conceptual system integral to its practice and expression, all at an achievable and optimal conceptual system. Through BSA and Afrocentric worldview is achievable, and the optimal conceptual system integral to its practice and expression is at once the inspiration for change and the evolution. From theory to practice. According to Norcross, the model of humanity that rests within the theoretical orientation is not merely philosophical for purists. The model affects which human capacities will be studied and cultivated, and which will be ignored and remain undeveloped. Treatment interventions inevitably flow from the clinician's underlying conceptions of pathology, health, reality, and therapeutic process. As systems of therapy embody the varying visions of life, reality, and testing, differing possibilities for human existence are implied. The psychotherapeutic approach of optimal psychology and belief systems analysis fits the definition. The psychotherapeutic approach of optimal psychology and belief systems analysis fits the definition of a commitment therapy in a contemporary psychotherapy. It is transformative, often involving conversion experiences. It takes on what a social context of the dominant U.S. culture would be considered religious or mythical symbolism. It is not authoritarian. While based on predictable consequences, the therapist may indicate preferences in this system but there is no error. Edit, please. Often involving conversion experiences, it takes on what the social context of a dominant U.S. culture would be considered religious or mythical symbolism. It is not preferences in this. Edit, please. It is the psychotherapeutic approach of optimal psychology and belief systems analysis fits the definition of a commitment therapy and the contemporary psychotherapy. It is transformative, often involving conversion experiences. It takes on what in the social context of dominant U.S. culture would be considered religious or mythical symbolism. It is not authoritarian. While based on predictable consequences, the therapist may indicate preferences. In this system, there is no error. Belief systems analysis for the client makes all choices their own choices. Belief systems analysis is informative and has much in common with many conventional therapies. According to an old proverb, if you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. In belief systems analysis, nothing can be further from the truth. Based on an optimal conceptual system, it is specific with regard to its goals and provides markers for the correct path. Our comparison of BSA to other psychotherapies has illustrated with specificity, directness, and the plan of focus what the differences actually are. Clearly, the main distinguishing characteristic of belief systems analysis is its endorsement of an optimal conceptual system based on an Afrocentric worldview, grounded in the wisdom tradition of African deep thought. For the optimal psychologist, belief systems analysis provides a consistent psychotherapeutic approach. For those who work with identified African American populations, BSA provides direction and a methodology for supplying much needed help. Its greatest contribution, however, is BSA's charge to think, critique, analyze, and understand. This is the path of self-knowledge. Forming discussion groups and supporting each other in our search for self-knowledge can expedite the process. In a sense, we can become our own therapist. That is the end of chapter 8. Thank you so much for joining us. Our conversation today will be chapter 8 of Understanding an Afrocentric Worldview, Introduction to an Optimal Psychology. And I'm happy to be here with you. My name is Linda James Myers, and also we have Dr. Julius Garvey. And we're going to be conversing this afternoon about therapeutic processes for a new age. Belief systems analysis. So in that context, what I would want to begin with is just the full realization that we are in a toxic, pathological, insane environment whereby everything our ancestors stood for is being overturned, and those cultures who have taken lead relative to their materialistic greed and quest for power and control and disrespect for nature now have it set up so that the people who are making social policies and implementing social practices without the real capacity to do so. They have no moral grounding, no moral anchor. Their level of moral development, as we discussed in previous chapter, is at a very low level. And so if there ever was a time we needed a therapeutic process, it would be now. And I believe that helping people examine their worldview and their belief system, ultimately their conceptual system, is going to be key, because we know, based on what our ancestors said, what Eastern philosophies say, what the Western science is saying, is that the reality we experience is totally subjective. And as a consequence, we have tremendous power to create whatever reality we desire. yet we give our power up. And so this chapter really focuses on how one can engage in a psychotherapeutic or psychoeducational process. But it also emphasizes the fact you don't need a therapist, you don't need a coach. This is something you can undertake and engage in yourself. So the real key is looking at your own belief system. And the challenge is most of us are simply at the effect of the belief system we've been socialized into, which is the dominant, suboptimal, fragmented, disintegrative one that has us insecure, fearful, competitive, and basically humanity on the brink of destruction. But belief systems analysis is based on a model of psychological functioning and a conceptual system that is thousands of years older than the one we've been socialized into. And as you know, because we're here talking about it, it didn't lead to disruption of nature or depletion of resources or pollution. So we have every reason to want to shift our cultural worldview and belief system. Dr. Garvey, you're a physician by training and practice. I know you must have seen on a daily basis over and over the consequences of the dominant culture's worldview, and also how people might benefit if they made that shift in worldview. I'm interested to know, and for the benefit of our listeners, where you found people to be relative to insight into what the true cause of their problems are.
Well, within the current conceptual system, I would say that, causes are not really sought. Symptoms are treated, and this is true, I would say, of physical illnesses, mental illnesses, psychoses, neuroses, etc. It's largely ameliorating symptoms. Because this is the perspective of Western culture in terms of how it has been set up, pretty much from the beginning, although it has gone through different cycles of, like short periods of we might call enlightenment, so to speak, when they've been in contact with African civilizations. Both in terms of the Moors and earlier on in terms of the Egyptians and other Africans and other people from the Near East. But the general belief of Westerners and those who have been incarcerated within the Western cultural, ideological, and educational system is a materialistic system that values things and appreciates what is brought to consciousness by the five senses. And consciousness here is a limited consciousness, which is called mind, where intellect is dominant and rational logic to utilize these five senses with their appropriate information, cognitive as well as emotive. So basically, the Western worldview and reality is based on a belief system of cognitive, emotive understanding and response to physical reality. So
Absolutely.
It's superficial, and it does not deal with the other way in which cognition, if you will, perception is possible, as opposed to cognitive emotive. Perception can also be intuitive, spiritual, if you will. And I think that's the difference between the African system, which was original for humankind. It was intuitive, and it was learning from nature as it existed. And that's how the hieroglyphics, which is a sacred language that That's how that came about. And that was the basis of all further language. But it was the sacred language because it was connected to nature and the experiences that one had of nature, including the experience that you had of yourself. So they're two totally different ways of experiencing the environment. We had talked previously about, the two cradle theory and, one, having an environment, our ancestors, where the environment was relatively supportive in terms of its tropical nature and its ability, our ability to feed ourselves in terms of plants and animals or fish, and et cetera, et cetera. So it was a relatively easy environment as opposed to, let's say, a European environment in terms of the Ice Age, et cetera, which was quite severe. But then there are also the ways in which you respond to environment as a human being, because these are the capacities that you have. And one is the so-called cognitive emotive. You can call it intellectual if you want. And the other one, and that's basically mind. And the other one is your intuitive spiritual response, where you actually experience what it is as it is. And this is the natural way of human experience, as opposed to the intellectual way. So we get into belief systems. Now, what is it that you believe? To believe is an intellectual function. It's not an experiential function. An experiential function says, I know, because I've experienced it. Of course, there are different kinds of knowledge. You can know because you've read or you've learned of something, or that's a particular fact, and somebody has certified that particular fact, and that's the way of science, shall we say. Or you can know in terms of some other descriptive thing, and that's knowledge in the Western perspective. Whereas there's another knowledge, which is a self-knowledge, and obviously we'll get to that in a sense, but that goes beyond belief systems. Again, it's a self-knowledge that takes us back to that way in which we perceive, which is an intuitive spiritual perception, and that gives you self-knowledge when it's internal, and it gives you valid knowledge of things as they are when it faces externally, as opposed to intellectual knowledge of the mind, which can conjure up any relationship of things, whether it's fantasy, whether it's illusion, or it's made of certain facts. And don't forget, facts change. Facts are not truth. Facts are simply information. So we have two different belief systems, and I'm interested in your breaking down the belief systems, because they're based on different ways of perceiving reality. And I I want to be fair, shall we say, if not charitable, to say that one way of looking at nature, at what is there outside us, which is the way of mind, and which is the way of cognitive emotive, can separate us from reality. Because I can be sitting here in New York, and I can be thinking about you there, 1,000 miles away. Now, what is real? My thought about you, or am I sitting in my chair here talking to you? Or I can be totally distracted, and I can be thinking about my wife who is in Florida and coming home tomorrow, and I have to pick her up at 10 o'clock from the airport. Those are thoughts, but they're not reality. But people can project those thoughts and create a reality out of those thoughts. And from those thoughts comes ideas, from those thoughts comes concepts. And then you try to verify those concepts, and then you even make them into laws. And that determines people's behavior. So there's a whole system that can be created out of a belief system that is predicated on aware perception.
Absolutely.
And there are two different ways to go about this.
Well, I love what you said about perception as intuition and the reality that our ancestors, intuition really comes from accessing or appercepting beyond what the five senses inform.
Absolutely.
And so our ancestors were clear about the subjective nature of human beingness. It is totally subjective. There's no reality out there. And what's interesting is that even Western science is telling us there's no reality out there. The only reality there is the one you're creating, which is predicated on your belief system. And so if you believe in the myth of objectivity, and you've created a reality out there based on what your five senses or what you think your five senses are informing, we just have to be reminded our five senses have no capacity to inform anything. They can appercept energies, but it's the pre-programming in our minds, hopefully in our heart minds, but probably in the West in our minds, that have us thinking certain things that have no substance. They're simply facts that we have over time come to accept as a reality and do not question. And as a consequence, in this social context, we've really set ourselves up for a lot of pain and anxiety and anger and violence and addictions and all those negative things that come when people are subjecting themselves to a reality of someone else's creation that they've accepted, that they have succumbed to, and do not realize that all perception is subjective. And being subjective, that means we have choice. We have choice in terms of what we think, we have choice in terms of what we feel, and we have choice in terms of the knowledge out there that we can access and that can be available to us. So the idea of creating reality and defining it in such a way that is more consistent with what we know about nature, because nature is key here. In the West, we work counter to nature because nature is not respected. We're not taught to understand we are nature. We are a part of nature. We're an expression of nature. So I just really, really, really want to reinforce what you're saying there about perception and intuition, and really reinforce the idea that what I'm perceiving has more to do with what my past experience has been than it has to do with anything happening out there exclusive of my participation. There's no reality I'm experiencing that I have not or am not participating in creating. So given that kind of power, we just want to encourage people to be optimal, maximally positive in their belief system, so that since we know from every cultural vantage point at the height of knowledge, we have tremendous power to create that which we desire. Let's create that which is going to bring health and peace and love and sustainable well-being. And to choose not to do that really makes no sense if our values have not been so distorted by the conceptual incarceration that's been imposed upon us and our ancestors for so very long. So we have the power to break out of that conceptual incarceration and understand that.
Put it in that sense and made it plain of the difference between subjectivity and objectivity, because the Western worldview has tried to validate total objectivity. It's only what you can measure, what you can see with your and measure with your and appreciate with your five senses. that's the only objective reality that there is. And that means that's the only reality that there is. And that means that the physical reality is the only reality that there is. So that's a very, very narrow spectrum. Now, if as science has moved forward, they've seen the narrowness of that spectrum, but they do not know how to get away from that defined objectivity of reality. Because, as you have mentioned, what science is now showing, and you know, this has been happening since at least the first half of the 20th century, basically in terms of quantum physics, is that, you know, consciousness is a part of reality. As a matter of fact, it's been shown now that consciousness is primary to reality, and consciousness is absolute reality. And materialism is relative reality. Things are relative reality, you know, that are produced by conscious energy. So we've gone beyond energy, you know, matter and energy, energy equals mc squared with Einstein. We've gone beyond that, where we have now added consciousness to energy as primary. And then it's the consciousness that drives the energy. And that's why, you know, when you get down to that level of matter, that's, you know, beneath the atoms and the neutrons and electrons, you get down to that level. There is no thing. There is whatever you want to call it. You know, there's just a field, a unified field, and it's a field where consciousness is primary. Consciousness determines everything. If you put your consciousness into it, it changes the field. So, but that now subjectivity has not been able to be integrated into Western philosophy and Western behavioral sciences. So they're, as you might say, hoisted on their own petard. They've denied this for not just for centuries, but for millennia. And they've denied it vehemently, because people who have had these experiences in the West, many have been burnt at the stake. You know, obviously the books have been burnt. We know that from the libraries at Alexandria and so on and so forth. We also know it with the Inquisition in Europe in the 15th century, and when they burned all the books again that had been brought over there, you know, by the Arabs and the Moors. So this whole other way of seeing reality, which is absolute reality, has been denied vehemently, certainly since the Council of Nicaea, etc., 300 AD, or whatever that is, 335 AD, and what have you. So that even the religion became materialistic and somehow mystical and otherworldly, but something that you could not experience. You know, it's like the capitalists now, you know, exporting the manufacturing. I mean, you know, because it was cheap. To do it in China and these other places. Well, it's the same thing. You export God and the experience of Christ, you know, to some entity that's out there, which is absolutely totally meaningless to the individual, and you know, who as a natural entity wants to understand themselves and wants to function appropriately. Optimally as oneself. And that means that proper mixture of spirit, mind, and body, where spirit has been taken completely out of it, and it's just mind and body. And any attempt to bring spirit in, as I say, whether it's in religion or in science, was denied over time. And that's where we're stuck. Definitely. So, as you say, it's up to us now to understand that we have to unstick ourselves, you know, because the knowledge is there. And we have to go back to a belief system that is more than a belief system, because it was founded on the experience, the intuitive spiritual experience of our ancestors, who were the first human beings. And whether the experience is 150,000 years ago or not, But these were the original experiences that were recorded, again, through our hieroglyphics and other alphabets that have come down to us, and other civilizations, Ethiopian, Kush, etc., that have come down to us. It's all there, and we have to do that education of ourselves now to shall I say, analyze the belief system that we've been incarcerated in, and to open up the belief system that we need in order to make ourselves whole.
Absolutely true. In fact, I'm reading here, perception is an active process in which the perceiver can, to a degree, construct his or her perception. The world discerned by the senses is not an external world, but a projected perception of what the mind is programmed to give meaning to or label. Much like a computer, information that is not in an acceptable or expected format is ignored and misinterpreted. So not only are we brainwashed and held in mental bondage by this suboptimal worldview, by its nature, it does not allow us to appercept or intuit the information we need, because it's not coming to us in an acceptable format. It's not counted or measured.
Right. Yeah, because what it is, our mind has been conditioned by the system through our educational process and through our socialization process, because we're in a world that has been dominated by the Western worldview, whether we live in the United States or the Caribbean or even in Africa itself. I mean, a lot of the African traditions have died out, shall we say, have been suppressed, et cetera, so that the Western perspective is what is validated and is what is taught in schools. And we've talked about this, many of the leaders, et cetera, of Africa. Where did they go to school? They go to the Sorbonne, they go to Oxford, they go to Cambridge, they go to MIT, et cetera, and Harvard. It's an incarceration of the mind, and we get back to liberating our minds from mental slavery. I think we've used that quotation several times. But until we liberate our minds, and again, that's the belief system thing that we're talking about. The belief system has been inculcated into our minds. We've been conditioned. It's a conditioning process that we go through from the earliest childhood, when we're miseducated in the educational system, so that we can no longer perceive reality as it is. You see, so this conditioning now suppresses or clouds over our innate self, which is what we were born with in terms of our pure consciousness that we came into the world with. And again, that's something that from the African perspective, we're not born in sin. There's no such thing as being, born in sin and some kind of human being that is aberrant. No, we are all made in the image of God, and in terms of our Creator, whether you want to call it God or nature or whatever. But we are mirror images of the divine, and all we have to do is to manifest that. Well, we have to know it. We have to get to know that before we can manifest it. And the problem then gets to self-knowledge. How do we get to know it? We're obstructed by the conditioning system that has gone on. So we have a whole aberrant psychic mental process that prevents us from being ourselves and from seeing the world as it is, as opposed to seeing the illusion that has been created by this false worldview.
We absolutely don't recognize or acknowledge it's an illusion. And I think in part that's because it's too painful to acknowledge something that you put so much time, energy, and focus into to succeed at, to acknowledge its illusion, to acknowledge its fake. I think when you were naming all these institutions, I am reminded of the young Black woman who was recently awarded the Rhodes Scholar. She's going to be a Rhodes Scholar. And Rhodes was horrible.
Yeah.
His whole notion was to control all of Africa. And he developed the scholarship so he could groom people to carry out his mission.
Yeah.
Yet we as people who are victimized by his mission, Rhodes Scholar, I was a Rhodes. No, but I like what Asa Hilliard had to say. He says, mental bondage is invisible violence. Creators and beneficiaries of belief systems develop a vested interest in that system. Mm-hmm. Priests or professors are ordained or certified as purveyors of the system, sometimes with the belief that they are objective or scientific. The general public usually accepts and comes to depend upon the doctrine or knowledge. So that's what has happened to us. We have all come, not all of us, some of us escaped. Most of us have come to depend upon that knowledge and that doctrine as the truth. And clearly, formal education is one of the higher or most effective purveyors of this faulty suboptimal belief system.
Linda, I think it's important for us to recognize at this point, and not that I mean to cut you, because I want you to continue with your thought, but we have had to pay a high price. In other words, if you don't knuckle under to this belief system, if you don't accept it, if you see things differently from the subjective or perspective, you're marginalized. And if that's not good enough, you're punished. And if that's not good enough, they get rid of you. And it's just like that, like I mentioned in the Inquisition, when they burned people at the stake. Well, you know about burning people, they've roasted us and so on, in terms of the lynching process, et cetera, because we did not want to subject ourselves to that way of behavior and that way of thinking in the South. So they hung us from trees and they burnt us, et cetera. But that's been going on for thousands of years. This is exactly what they did in Alexandria when they burnt the library. They also killed all the professors. You see, of the Egyptian mystery system, if you will, you can call it that. Some people call it that. So there's been this violence that has supported this system. And that in itself is an indication that the system is not natural, because you have to sustain it by violence. Then you look at so many of the systems. Look at the agricultural system. You see, it's not self-sustaining. It's not natural. You have to keep adding fertilizer, and you have to keep plowing more, and you have to put more water, and you have to put herbicides, and you have to put fungicides, and you have to put more this and more. It's not a natural way of growing food. You see, and it's the same. And you look at the medical system. It's not natural. You said in terms of my medical experience, everybody who came into my office who was over 50 was on at least 5 pills, if not more. That was the minimum, And it was 1 pill for this, 1 pill for that, and 1 pill for that, all treating symptoms. These were chronic ailments, which are the lifestyle, another name for the lifestyle ailments that we have. And people don't want to change, or the system tells them don't change in terms of the advertising that you see on TV or wherever else you find the advertising. So you're coerced into the system in different ways. Hollywood, the media, the newspapers, all of the media pushes you in this particular direction. You try to go in a different direction from what is the accepted direction of, quotes, the majority of the people. And the majority of the people are led by these few at the top who define the systems, create the systems, and benefit from the system. And this has gone on, certainly I identified it in the religious sense from, let's say, the Council of Nicaea. The big guys got together and said, look, we're going to get this book into the Gospels and the New Testament. We're not going to get these in there because they don't suit our purpose, and so on and so on and so forth. And this has gone on century after century after century. And that's how we've come to the situation that we're in. So it's important for people to understand that This is it's a system that cannot stand on its own and has attempted to destroy anyone or any group of people that would, shall we say, speak against the system or would develop an alternative system that they think is more appropriate. So if you stand out in the crowd, they chop off your head, so to speak. And that's how it's a whole herd environment where you have to do, what is said in the New York Times on the editorial page or wherever it is, and hence all of a sudden now, the Ukrainians are these wonderful people when they were allies of the Nazi Germans and so on. But, so you're doing about face, and he said, yes, sir. Otherwise, you're ostracized, et cetera, et cetera. But this happens, with any issue. All of a sudden, abortions are no longer valid. Now, how does that happen?
it's bizarre.
The law changed. What's the moral or the value behind this? I mean, is there anything that is permanent and fully subjective about this? How can it just change like that overnight by 5-3 or whatever it was? I mean, so there's no stability to a system that can change overnight depending on somebody's vote. It has no validity in nature as a process.
Absolutely true. And I think if people really stop and consider the fear factor that you keep pointing us to, if you can instill fear in people, it's the big driver. It's probably one of the biggest drivers next to love. Mm-hmm. But we know perfect love casteth out all fear. Mm-hmm. And so I'm thinking about our ancestors I'm particularly now thinking about the Zulu, when the English came with their guns and they would just run into the bullets, and the British couldn't understand what is wrong with these people. They're letting us kill them. Well, what was right with these people is that they didn't fear death because that wasn't part of their belief system. That wasn't a part of their worldview. And I think the challenge for us is, because we're following people who have competed or tried to compete against nature and have lost, have competed or tried to compete against nature and have lost, we now don't have the kind of nutrients in our soil so that people can grow food that's worth eating. The air is polluted, the water's polluted, everything's carcinogenic. And the people who created this are people who supposedly follow the science based on an objectivity that doesn't exist, that's an illusion. At some point, I think, Dr. Garvey, we just need to stop and say, hold up, wait a minute, this isn't making sense, because right now, humanity's on the precipice of destruction. It's not going to be destroyed. We understand that from our ancestors' teaching. But those who follow others over that precipice, I can't really speak for them. But I think the reality seems to be that as long as we don't learn how to be in harmony with nature, and part of being in harmony with nature is me wanting to eat what's healthy and whole and preferably raw, and stay away from processed foods and sugar, all white things, take them out of my diet, and all the way agribusiness has ruined food and soil and animal, I think red meat is probably fine if you got it from the cow right off the pasture. You probably would be pretty much okay grass-fed, but it's not. It's produced by agribusiness in these horrible meat packing plants. And if you ever pass one within 10 miles, you could smell it. I mean, it's just nothing about what we're subconsciously or consciously programmed to believe about reality and what's true and science and objectivity and all this has any substance, it becomes clear for those who hope to see. But again, as a psychologist, I'm always interested in what could these people be thinking that they think this is okay and that they follow it. But I do understand how seductive materialism is. Materialism is extremely seductive, particularly if you live in a social context that's constantly bombarding you with buy this, get that, live here, live that, get this degree, this place, and over time you begin to think, oh, okay, well, I guess I'm doing it. But I guess, Dr. Garvey, for me, one of the things we do know as people who are mental health professionals, or some of us know, is these people aren't happy. They're not happy. Mm-hmm. They're not even well. They don't even feel good. So at some point, I think focusing on the subjective nature of reality rather than an externalized definition given us by somebody else can be very helpful. How does this make me feel? And it'll be uncomfortable for a while because you've been programmed to feel a certain way about certain things. But we do know that mental bondage is invisible violence. So if we can somehow step back and really see if we can get in touch with the subjective nature of a reality that can bring us a sense of peace, security, sustainable well-being, those are the rewards of a conscious mind, conscious of its nature as being one with a divinely inspired creative force that is indeed infinite. That is certainly a system of programming. All that information that I just said probably just went, whoop, because we have been programmed so that it's not the expected format, it's not the acceptable format that we're used to hearing, but it is the correct format. Because basically what I'm suggesting is coming from that divine feminine, if you will, and what's been propagated has come from the masters of deception of a masculine patriarchal system that is only interested in power and control. And that's how you can determine what the Supreme can determine what a woman can or cannot do with her body. And then set a system in place that if she chooses not to give birth to a child, in some states, even if it's as a victim of rape or incest, I'm impregnated, you want me to give birth to this child? Yet once I do, sorry for it. It's just insane because it's absent any kind of spiritual acumen, any kind of moral foundation, no evidence of a compass, no evidence of moral reasoning. So we have how many people on the Supreme Court? 9? Sitting there making decisions. A couple of them who we know probably are not fit for service just because of their mental difficulties that are so apparent. But there's nothing in the social structure or context that allows people to rebel or take them out or whatever for the reasons you just described, fear. Mm-hmm. We're feared to speak truth to power. Mm-hmm. But if we don't speak truth to power, we'll just be destroyed by that power for generations to come.
Now is a good wake-up time in terms of us as a people. I don't know if you've seen, something circulating on WhatsApp and so on and so forth. Like 20 plus Africans were killed in an enclave in part of Morocco. I guess they were trying to get to the Mediterranean and cross over into Europe. But these are, 28 young people, young Africans who are, trying to get away, from their poverty, et cetera, et cetera. We know how that has come about. We've seen the brutality here in the United States. We know that the system is a globalized system, and it's not changing anytime soon. So we are the ones that have to do the changing for ourselves,
Absolutely.
to create the alternative systems. And again, I think that's something that my father brought 100 years ago for us to understand this. And, we have to seek out like minds and like people, so that we have some strength in our unity. But it is an individual process. It is based on knowing the system, knowing what you believe and what you don't believe, knowing what is truth and what is not truth. But then it boils down to internalizing what you know, so that it becomes self-knowledge, because it's only through self-knowledge, I mean, it's plain in the words, that you actually know yourself. And it's only through knowing yourself that you can be yourself. And to be yourself consistently means consistently knowing yourself. So it's one of these things that's automatic once you get into the driver's seat in
Yes.
terms of who you are. So you have to get to that self-knowledge of knowing who you are. Because when you know who you are, then you're one with the reality of life, because who you are is absolute reality, which is consciousness. And you're one, and consciousness obviously has no border. So you're at the center of a universe. You're at the center of your universe. And you live then in your world, and you do what you need to do intuitively, based on the fact that everything is one within your universe. All these things that happen in terms of living is happening in your universe, which is oneness, and you move those things around as you see fit, which is your intuitive wisdom. So that then within that you create the order and the harmony and the balance and the reciprocity and the peace and the joy that you want, and that is your expression of yourself, which is your expression of your source. And that is what Ma'at is all about. And that's what our ancestors are all about. And that's what the gods are all about. They're not gods, they're functional principles that are embedded in us. Like we talked about the lilies in the field, it comes from the seed. Embedded in the seed is the lily. Embedded in the seed of the oak is the oak tree. Embedded in us is the manifestation of Ma'at, the order, because everything is integrated in terms of the oneness that we are a part of. So, it's all there, but we have to get to that. And it's not so much a learning process. We have to unlearn the ignorance that has clouded us and has conditioned us from ourselves to prevent us from seeing ourselves. But once we begin to see ourselves, then everything unfolds in terms of who we are as a natural process, because we're natural human beings. And being a natural human being is a really wonderful thing, which took 16 billion years of evolution to create us. But this is not validated. We're being treated like we're little machines, that can do this and do that, and we can be replicated by robots. I mean, this is so ridiculous. We've gone into this whole artificial intelligence, because the Western worldview sees us more like a computer, and sees us as an entity, neurons that can be conditioned, and therefore you control the mind, and you can have them behave in this way and that way and that way and do precisely what you want. Not understanding the sacredness of the human being. And this is the tragedy. It's a humanitarian tragedy. We're not allowed to embrace our sacredness and be who we really are, which is manifestation of a divine source. So it's extremely important for us to get to this state of self-knowledge. And of course, we will be moving in that direction in terms of helping us to understand how we do that.
Absolutely. In fact, there are three things I want us to consider today before we close. And one is making this shift from the false reality to into which we've been programmed for the benefit of other people versus getting back into the reality of ourselves as spirit beingness and being one with the source of all good. And I think the first thing that I would suggest people do is focus on their own sense of self-esteem and self-worth. We've got to move away from a sense of identity and worth based on external criteria. And quit being so concerned about what other people think. Mm-hmm. I used to tell my students, if other people are crazy, why do you care what they think? Mm-hmm. If they're buying into a reality that's fiction, that's self-destructive, that is leading humanity to the brink, destroying the resources, alienated from nature, alienated from the spiritual aspect of being, which we now know as consciousness and is primary, we have to totally switch what we've been told is true and what's of value and what's the nature of knowledge. I think the second thing is health and resourcefulness. We have to cease feeling that we are forced to respond or react to things in a particular kind of way. If we think we have to respond to someone else's ignorance by feeling bad about ourselves, they'll keep being ignorant and keep you constantly embroiled in all the toxicity that comes from your internalizing oppression. You'll be hypertensive. You'll be prone to so many things that you really could avoid if you could withdraw your health and your resourcefulness from somebody else's definition of reality and create your own. Because by design, you are born with the power and will to do that. And last but not least, this whole notion of prosperity and self-determination. We have to really think about our own desires of ourselves as infinite spirit with access to infinite supply and start relying on faith and trust and patience. I know that sounds like, oh, yeah. But the reality is you're going to do that anyway if you're going to make it through this remass. Because the people who have got us to this point have a vision down the road that's worse than this. This isn't going to get better. It's going to get worse and worse and worse. So, stop now. Take your power back. Begin to critically reflect on and examine all the things that are going on around us. And then make a determination about what you believe is true. Either you're one with the source of all good, that creative life force, that consciousness which was at the beginning, is now and shall ever be, or you're not. And if you're not, well, that's a whole nother illusion you can get caught up in and become devoted to. But if you are, as our ancestors understood, we create heaven and hell right here, right now. It's our decision. What we haven't been so fully exposed to is the specifics about the hell that's been created and how to withdraw and reverse it to the heaven that we deserve. So, anywho, that's my soapbox for this afternoon.
Great. I mean, that's a good summary, and we look forward to going the next step. I think that the people who are going to make the next step are those who have become dissatisfied with a particular way of life. And very often that happens in midlife. You get the so-called midlife crisis when, as we've been talking about, we're conditioned, and we're conditioned to seek pleasure, because that's the result of the feelings of our five senses, but to seek it outside of ourselves because it's things that give us pleasure. So we're seeking all of these things outside ourselves, including, as you mentioned, self-esteem, because the more things you have and the more pleasure you have, then the more people think you're a wonderful guy or girl or whatever. So you accumulate all these things, and then you stress yourself out in terms of all the things that you're trying to do, all the things you're trying to accumulate, accomplish, and so on and so forth. When the most important thing is in life is to become yourself. That's the real goal of life. And that's how you get meaning in life. The meaning in life is to become yourself. When you become yourself, then you are experiencing all of these wonderful things that we've talked about in terms of harmony and peace and order and justice and so on. These are natural things that are embedded in us, and all we have to do is access them so that we can manifest them in our day-to-day lives. It's not something that takes us outside of living. It's something that once we have accessed it, then we manifest it on a 24/7 basis in terms of our workplace, in terms of being father, wife, husband, child, whatever, worker. So this is the way life is supposed to be. We're supposed to manifest this life, which is what we came into the world with, in this unpolluted way before we became conditioned. So, we have to get to this. And I said, many of us, speaking for myself, especially, you get to this dead end somehow in midlife when you say, I've done this, I've done that, I've done this, I've done that a million times. And it's not really fun anymore. Just kind of repeating this over and over and over. I've accumulated this or that or the other thing, or I've been through hell here, there, or whatever. And that's not working. So then you have to look at the system, which we've talked about quite a bit, and then you have to look at yourself and how you've bought into the system. And when you see the system isn't working, then you have to disconnect yourself from the system. And that's where we are. And hopefully there are a lot of people who want to do that because it's critical. Because the system is carrying us to oblivion. As you say, I don't think the planet is in danger because the planet will continue. But I think the species is in danger. If we don't want to leave the planet for the cockroaches and the viruses, etc., we better get with it to a different belief system and a different subjective way of looking at the world.
Yeah, so, absolutely true. And we're quite vulnerable. And one of the things that I think, Dr. Garvey, that's so important that your dad just was totally on top of, that is community. Mm-hmm. He understood the kingdom of heaven is within me, but if I can't bring the collective to that realization, what good is it? What is my purpose? And I think that has
to be manifested in everyday life. It's not something that you're going to a cave, you're going to the mountains, you're going to the jungle or whatever it is. No, that's not really what spirituality is about in terms of our ancestors. And, it's something that you bring to the community and you create a society based on that in terms of, your giving and in terms of your love, in terms of your compassion, in terms of your contribution and wanting to see, everyone prosper, not just yourself.
Absolutely true. And I think for me, that's why I enjoy our conversation so much, to just talk to someone who gets it and who's on the same path. And I think as more and more of us come together, then some of the things that make it so difficult to reject the missocialization and come out of the conceptual incarceration and bondage will be replaced with that kind of Matian experience of sustainable well-being. And so that's what we're working for.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, so I look forward to our next meeting.
Yes, until the next time.
Great.
Good afternoon or good day or good night, wherever you are listening to this at this time. We're so happy you're joining us. Once again, so very happy to be back with Dr. Julius Garvey to discuss optimal psychology and that transformation of consciousness that we as humanity so desperately need, but very much needed by people acknowledging African ancestry. So we're here today to continue that discussion, and we're going to be picking up on actually chapter 8 of my book that focuses on the psychotherapeutic approach of making that transformation in consciousness, process I developed called belief systems analysis. So we're going to begin there because one of the things that's definitely true, even back at the height of the Garvey movement, the Honorable Marcus Garvey was very clear. We need to take back control of our minds and move toward our cultural agenda. So years later, we have Martin Luther King in 1967 making a speech to the American Psychological Association, talking about we really have to, as Black people, if we're going to survive, shift our focus away from following people who have not the capacity to lead us toward health and wholeness. And we really must begin to pursue an African cultural-based and centered orientation to mental health and sustainable well-being. So that's where we pick up in terms of optimal psychology. How can we expand human consciousness with a new psychological frame of reference that is actually ancient, coming to us from the beginnings of human culture and civilization?
Well, it's good to be back, and Linda, and discussing this. And I just came back from Accra, Ghana, where there was a conference in terms of reparative justice, reparations, and racial healing. The problem in some sense was described, but it never really got down to the essence of how do you bring about racial healing?
Yes.
In terms of an actual psychological approach or spiritual approach or what have you. In terms of my own participation, I wanted to do that and started with an educational approach, because that's one of the things that we have to do in terms of changing our minds and getting out of mental slavery. We have to be educated in terms of what our history is.
Yes.
We also have to be educated, or at least knowledgeable in that sense of self and what our true potential is as human beings. And we never really got to that stage because of the way in which the conference was set up, shall we say. But, Joy DeGruy presented some of her material there on the post-traumatic slavery syndrome, which is very real in terms of our inferiority complex, shall we say, our disconnection from our identity, our anxieties, our fears, our self-hate. All of those things that we know exist within us and really need to be healed to make us whole people. And, I think that's where a great deal of focus needs to be at this time, because, clearly whether you use, 1865 or 1807 or 1838 in the Caribbean, or 1804 in Haiti, whatever, date you use in terms of our emancipation from physical slavery, it's quite clear that our minds have not been emancipated. And I would say that there is not a specific methodology that is African-centered, if you will, that approaches the problem from the African perspective, as opposed to simply behavioristic psychology or transpersonal psychology or whatever the current European approach to psychology is, whether it's Freudian or Jungian or more, more recent entities in terms of their own understanding of mind. Whereas we have had an understanding of mind, as you just mentioned, that goes back thousands of years, and we need to build on that. And I think that, my understanding of the work that you've done and what we've been discussing really is the only aggregation of understanding of the psychological importance of, you might say, an Afrocentric worldview, an Afrocentric belief system, and its ability to liberate our minds so that we can live, pretty much, joyful, productive lives without the fear and the anxiety and the trauma and the reaction to the trauma that we've been assaulted with, for the last 400 years. In terms of, can you unpack then the belief system that we're talking about when you say belief system?
Sure.
And that is, we're analyzing the current Eurocentric belief system from the Afrocentric perspective.
Absolutely, because one of the things that our ancestors was very clear about is that all is mind, all is consciousness. And so one's belief system or conceptual system is what the assumptions are that are going to inform what you're perceiving, what you're thinking, feeling, doing, experiencing. And unfortunately, we have been subject to not a post-traumatic enslavement syndrome, a perpetually traumatizing enslavement syndrome. We're constantly being traumatized by a faulty and flawed belief system. I call it suboptimal. And it's coming to us from Euro-Western culture. And it starts with a faulty ontological premise about the nature of reality itself. Our ancestors were very clear. They said all is spirit, all is energy, all is consciousness, all is one. And then there are various manifestations. If you start with that premise, then your worth as a human being is becoming conscious of your fullness and your divinity within the one. Your worth is intrinsic. That's so counter to how the captors of our ancestors wanted to frame things, because if people understood who they really were, there would not be racism, sexism, classism, because we would disrupt it. We would disrupt it by not allowing or believing in or adopting a belief system that would affirm the idea that a system which assigns value and allocates opportunity based on skin color and phenotypic differences is anything more than a faulty, flawed, deficient system of moral reasoning. Now, there's a reason our ancient ancestors were so committed to Ma'at. Ma'at has to do with truth, justice, and righteousness. It has to do with moral reasoning. The 42 declarations of innocence that people were required to take or make as they transition to the higher level of consciousness, the European called the 42 negative confessions. I'm sure they were negative confessions for them. They were declarations of innocence for us, because we understood how important that spiritual aspect of being is to our being. And we understood that indeed, without an optimal worldview or a belief system that reinforced our intrinsic worth, our intrinsic value, our aspirational goal of being one with the divine infinite forces, the process of moving through life's stages, including the stage we call death in the West, is part of a natural order, which if we begin to comprehend and learn how to go with that flow, we can achieve. if not everlasting peace and happiness, we certainly can achieve a sense of sustainable well-being, which becomes impossible if we adopt that suboptimal view that has us basing our identity and worth on external criteria, our income, our position. So when our education, our scholars, our sages of contemporary times told us, if you control the way people think, you control the people, they were quite serious. And so what optimal psychology does is it presents to us how our thinking is controlled by our missocialization into that faulty and flawed, fragmented, materialist cultural worldview that our ancestors' captors built this nation on. And that same fragmented, suboptimal worldview is alive and well today. But the good news is we have the power within us, if we so decide, to define reality for ourselves in a way that's consistent with our African ancestry. So that's what leads us to this optimal psychology. And the process of making that shift in consciousness from the menocidal conceptual incarceration to the liberation, the illumination of the soul that our ancestors prided themselves on, is analyzing our own belief system and then making a decision about what it is we believe is true. Do we believe what our ancestors' captors said is true about the nature of reality, knowledge, who we are, how one knows? Or do we believe what our ancestors for at least 6,000 years we can document said was true? Hopefully we go for our ancestors, because what we see is that Western culture is an anomaly in human history. Never before in human history have we seen a people found their cultural frame of reference totally on what we call lower level of consciousness, where greed and materialism is used to justify the enslavement of millions of young Africans who are captured and then trafficked to the Americas to build the wealth of this nation, their captors, and the Western world. That mindset was not known before in human history as you look at all the cultural groups. African people, they definitely went around the world, explored, left impressions on the people that were very positive, but nobody colonized or stole the land and then pushed the people off onto reservations or tried to annihilate them. And I guess the main thing, Dr. Garvey, is that we need to understand as Black people, as human beings, that same mindset is a mindset that has been imposed on us. It's the same mindset that's alive and well today that says 1% of the world's population can control 98% of the world's wealth and think that's priority and okay. That mindset that can say to women, you know what, you really don't have any control of your bodies anymore. We're just going to put that on hold and we're going to make it a legislative and legal issue. All that insanity is coming to us from a faulty and flawed conceptual system, belief system, if you will. But we know how to make the shift. And I'm happy to say that we have found, as people have used optimal psychology or optimal conceptual theory and the psychoeducational, psychotherapeutic process belief systems analysis for the last 35 years with tremendous success. So Black people want to come to therapy because they want to understand what's really going on with them, why they're depressed, why they're anxious, how they can get out of it. And they want to build community so that they can have opportunity to fellowship with others who are pursuing the same knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Sorry, long answer to your short question.
No, that's very profound, statement, because I think that the basis of the problem, shall we say, is that the European conceptual understanding of self as a human being is limited, and is limited to the physical form and the mental manipulation of sensory input through the five senses. And that's all that a human being is considered to be. Basically mind and body, and then an ego, as a self-identity, manipulates, mind and body again for their own individual aggrandizement, if you will, gaining for themselves individually the best of whatever is out there. And that's been there right from the beginning. There was an attempt when the Greeks went to the Near East and went to North Africa, to Egypt, to learn. Many people, such as Plato and Socrates, Aristotle, and Pythagoras, and so on, went to learn, and some of them did learn. The basic understanding of civilization that was present in chemists. But when they brought it back, it was considered to be an alien philosophy, if you will, for the Greeks themselves. And they continued with that limited worldview instead of becoming civilized. Like so many other people have become civilized based on the Kemetic understanding of Nubia, Kush, etc. Now, value understanding of what humanity is fully, meaning that we're not just mind and body, but we're spirit, and spirit is in charge of mind and body. And if you say you're a spirit, that means you're one with universal spirit, which is the source. Of course, nowadays we call it unified field because we're in quantum physics and subquantum mechanics. But it's the same thing that our ancestors, spoke of in terms of our primordial ground, our source, or as they said in those days, nature nateru, which was the Mother Nature, if you will, which is very much the same thing as the unified field theory. It's just that these people now come up with a name and say, oh, gee, we've discovered something. They haven't anything at all. It's always been there in terms of, our understanding of who we are as people and what the universe is and how we relate to the universe. We're never separate from nature. And if you look at all of African thinking, it's natural. It's a natural understanding of the world. It's an understanding of nature. It's an understanding of human nature. It's an understanding of plants. It's an understanding of the function of animals. I mean, it's all there. It's an imitation of nature or a manifestation of nature. Whereas what you have with the Eurocentric approach is a conceptual understanding of what's out there as a thing and a belief that you can manipulate anything in any way that you want to manipulate it in order to benefit yourself as an individual. And that's even the basis of science, which has gone crazy.
That's
in terms
true.
of agricultural inputs and so on and so forth. They're poisoning the groundwater. They're giving us seeds that can't regenerate because supposedly that the seed in fungi or something like that. But all they do is have to follow the natural way of farming, in terms of using compost and so on. But they've chemicalized everything, and they've done the same thing, all across the board, whether it's medicine with the human being, or it's agriculture, or it's farm animals, and what they do with the animals, the chickens, the cows, and so on and so forth. So these are systems that are an aberration that's been developed out of a lack of full understanding of who we are as humans and what nature is, because supposedly materialism only deals with matter. And yet still what they've found in terms of quantum physics, that matter is 99.9% space. So there you are dealing with the 0.01% of the universe, and you're calling it the science. I mean, that's ridiculous. We have a science of space. The science of space is the science of consciousness, which is what we have been talking about. The thing, though, is that we have been so inundated, shall we say, with this particular worldview. We get it from the New York Times, the Washington Post, we get it from CNN, we get it from Fox News. We turn on the TV or we go to the movies and, we get it streaming. We get it all the way from Tarzan, Birth of a Nation, coming on down. All of this dysfunction. I mean, you turn on the TV set and you barely get any entertainment, and you get 10 commercials. 80% of the time that you're watching TV is commercials, and the other 20% is garbage. Because it's all about people expressing their emotions, as if to say, now, this is the normal way for a human being to express anger or jealousy or pride or sexuality. This is the norm. I mean, the norm, the Eurocentric norm, is abnormal. If
It's
you don't
so
want to
true.
call it neurosis, or maybe you don't want to call it psychosis, you can at least call it the neurosis. And but the point is that we've been so inundated with it that it's extremely difficult for us to disconnect. And I think that's one of the keys. We have to find those ways to disconnect.
It is so true. It is so true. So I think for me, one of the things that's so troubling is that our formal educational system has been a key system to perpetuate the brainwashing. So now when you even see scholars trying to analyze the problems around gender identity or sex roles or gender roles or what's happening with Black men or Black women, they're using that same Euro-Western lens that doesn't have the capacity to bring insight into an analysis of the problem, much less the solution. So they stay up on the surface aspect of what appears to be the problem, never go to the root of the problem, never go to the root of the cause of racism. The cause of racism isn't, I shouldn't say what it isn't as much as what it is. What it is a moral deficiency. And if you have a moral deficiency and we're spiritual beings, we basically are self-destructing. And therefore, we don't see the connection to all that is. And that moral insufficiency encourages us to put materialism and acquisition of object above anything else. So you can pollute the air, the soil, now they want to pollute the cosmos with sending all kinds of technology up. And all of those science is fine, but it needs to be a kind of science that allows us to study from a holistic and integrative fashion. If we do this, what is the outcome going to be? No, I just heard on the news today, I think they're putting $52 billion in technology so we can have the microchips produced ourselves. Really? You can't feed the children, you can't educate them, you can't give them people health care they need. But you probably are going to put $52 billion into something so somebody can make a whole bunch of money, probably somebody who already has billions of dollars. And they're not going to be thinking about, okay, since all nature is interrelated and interconnected, what's going to happen when we throw up into outer space, so to speak, all kinds of what will be garbage? Chinese garbage just fell to Earth, I think, last week and crashed somewhere in the Indian Ocean. Could have crashed anywhere. But all of that's going to be crashing and burning because of the nature of the mindset, the belief system of people who are in power and in control. So if we as Black people, as human beings, the real human beings, if we don't take our power back and begin to define reality in a way that's consistent with the height of science across even Western culture, Eastern philosophies, African common sense, then we're going to be really on the brink of destruction that we see. And from a mental health standpoint, that toxicity, the pathology, will begin to overtake us as we see it has done in the past 50 years. It used to be the case, Dr. Garvey, you probably remember this. If we knew there was a mass shooter or something really crazy happening, we knew it wasn't a Black person who did it. If we hear suicide, we knew it was very unlikely it was a Black person who committed suicide. That's not the case anymore. So we need to begin to question why do we now see an increased rate of suicide among Black people, Black men, Black women, Black children? What's happened? Have things gotten so bad? Well, they are bad, but what's really happened is that cultural belief system and worldview that sustained us earlier on in our history had cultural roots, deep cultural roots, that grounded us to a spiritual aspect of being that said, persevere, keep the faith, maintain your hope, use your free will. And as we've been educating our children and the society as a whole into the flawed and faulty pathological system, the suboptimal system, now those kinds of guards and protections that were afforded us culturally have begun to dissipate.
I think you're exactly right. And going back to my father's thinking 100 years ago, I think what African people wanted at that time, and again, coming out of that period in the early part of the 20th century, First World War, etc., the migration, out of Jim Crow South, of 1 million, African Americans from 1910 to 1925 to the north, to places like Detroit, Chicago, Philadelphia, and so on, looking for space, looking for work, looking for a place to build communities. And of course, we know that communities were built in many different areas. But a lot of these communities were destroyed as soon as they were shown to be prosperous. And in some cases, competitive, meaning that they had their own resources and could be independent of the majority of society. And, such as with Tulsa in 1921, the Black Wall Street and, the Red Summer of 1919 and so on. So many race riots in the North where they were attacking African-American people and African-American communities. And then we fast forward into the 60s, because that resistance was broken down, shall we say, and dispersed. And then what came up again in terms of an attempt to restructure was channeled down, to restructure ourselves as a people, was channeled into integration. Now we were going to be one with the society, the majority of society that has always oppressed us and dehumanized us. Dr. King understood that, as you mentioned, at the top of what we were saying today, that this is not what we needed. But he became very unpopular towards the end of his life, because of that, because he strayed away from the integration idea. And of course, with that integration, is everybody on the one tent, so to speak, and join with the people who had oppressed us in terms of their morals and their values and their philosophy and their educational system and their scientific system. We were learning the same things, and we were being cast down to learn it. So we no longer had our own schools, we no longer had our own teachers, we no longer had the independence. And if you look at our churches, which strove for independence, they began to go back into the type of Christianity, if you will, that the fundamentalists were basically preaching, and it became very much a prosperity Christianity, as opposed to the values that we cherish in terms of community and sharing and love and kindness and compassion and so on. So those were the things that happened to us from the early part of the 20th century coming on, because everything was beaten down in terms of our independence. And now I think we have a majority of our people who are simply trying to get along and be part of the system. And the system is a system that oppresses us. So we have something which is very much sadomasochistic, where we are admiring and despises us and abuses us. And, that's the worst kind of mental illness when we're enjoying the perversity. The interesting thing, I shouldn't say interesting thing, my belief system, I think this is part of my own experience as a human being, is that we're born into this three dimension, a physical world of mind, body, cause, and effect, with a spiritual understanding and a spiritual awareness as children, as young children. But unfortunately, we're born into a cultural milieu that very quickly educate us or miseducate us or condition us culturally by certain beliefs, certain behavior patterns that we have to participate in. Otherwise, we get punished. We have to get punished at home. Mama says this, daddy says that. Wait till daddy comes home, he's going to whip your head. But a teacher says you're disruptive because you're asking questions and you should be just memorizing what the teacher says, da-da-da, and up and down the line. So you have to behave in such a way that it's appropriate, culturally appropriate. Culturally appropriate for a dysfunctional system, so you become a dysfunctional human being. Mm-hmm. Part of what I think we're saying, is that we still have that memory of who and what we were, what we came here to be. And despite the fact that we have been culturally conditioned, but whatever age you are, I've been culturally conditioned for a very long time. But, we're even culturally conditioned for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, or 50 years, or plus. I'm in the plus section. But you have to relocate that memory of what you were when you came into the world. Now, you may not be able to remember specifics, but most of us can remember some aspects of childhood. But again, it's not some behavior. But how did you think? What was your presence? And this always comes back to me. And it's like a conscious awareness of who and what I was before I became what I ended up being by virtue of what was permitted to me at the different levels of growth. And I think this is what each of us has to do, certainly as a start. There's obviously a whole bunch of education that has to be done. And as you've been saying, you have to reach something of a crisis, I think, within yourself, where you understand that the system is not doing well by you. You're able to look at the system, you see it's dysfunctional, and you see that you're participating in a dysfunctional system. And you're accepting all of those dysfunctions, meaning whether you have the anxieties, the fear, the anger, all of the attachment and the desire, the accumulation, all this wealth, and you're not really happy within the system because it's a system that continually frustrates you. You're striving to get X thing. You don't get X thing and you keep striving, or you get X thing, then you're striving to hold on to it. X thing is that it's not exactly what you wanted, So you want to get rid of X thing, maybe a wife, the first wife, the second wife, or the third wife was changed on you in terms of your imagination. But you never really reach a stage of optimal well-being. I'm going to play on your word optimal. You never reach a stage of optimal well-being when you're being continually seduced by desire for the accumulation of things. But you have to reach sort of crisis, I think, in your own mental, emotional life and say, gee, this isn't working for me. And of course, a lot of people call that the midlife crisis. But I think to that level, we don't have to wait to the midlife, we need to get to that level early on.
Oh, that's true.
Is that this is a system that, as you mentioned earlier, cannot solve the problems that it has created. It's up and down. It has no ability to solve climate change. It can't solve climate change. You have got to change the system completely. That's not the climate change problem. It cannot solve any of these problems. It cannot solve war. or peace. It has to change the system. It can't be individualistic and competitive. Because if you're individualistic and competitive, then you're always going to want something that somebody else wants, and you're going to end up going to war to get it. So all of these things are built into the system, and we have to remove ourselves from the system, or better yet, remove the system from ourselves, and get to that how should I place that is intrinsic to us. And I think we are born with it. And that's what my art is all about,
Yes.
is this relationship that we as individuals, which are, holographic individuals of the totality, no different from the totality. And of course, if you say that in a different language, people are saying you're blasphemous if you use the Christian language, so to speak, and saying that you're one with God or you're a manifestation of God itself. Oh, you're crazy, you're blasphemous. But no, that's the original African concept, that we're simply a manifestation of the unity that created us in the first place.
Well, sir.
We get back to this is what we came as before we come to a position to believe that we were separate individuals and we needed to compete in order to get good things.
Absolutely true. In fact, Jesus Christ taught, and his prayer for his disciples was that they realized they're one with God and him, as indeed he realized he was one with God. So it's not blasphemy at all to consider oneself in union. In fact, one of my books is Blessed Assurance. I take biblical scriptures, one a week for 52 weeks, so that people can begin to see what's in the sacred text that they didn't delete and use their power of discernment to make that shift, because the cultural worldview that has you believing yourself as separate is toxic. It's pathological. It will literally make you suffer. And what we have to help people see, Dr. Garvey, is that it doesn't matter if you're a 1%er or in utter poverty. The system doesn't work. We tend to think that for the billionaires, things are working. Trust me, it's not. The pathology, the kind of behavior we see them engaging in, the kind of sexual dysfunction and substance abuse and all kinds of craziness that is just prominent in those environments is what you get when you pursue that belief system. And because it doesn't work, and it doesn't work for anyone, many of us don't understand that. We think, well, if I just get more money, if I just get this title, if I just get this, and as you point out, you get it and you go, wait a minute, there must be more and more and more. You never get enough. You're not happy. And you are going to suffer from anxiety, depression, substance abuse. Those things now have been normalized. So they have medications, drugs you can take legally for all those things. Of course, they're going to have side effects that'll probably kill you. But what I hope people get from this is the realization that we talk about liberation. We talk about, you began to share what was happening at the conference in Ghana on reparations. The most critical resistance you can muster and legislate is resistance to that suboptimal belief system, to that faulty worldview. When you say, oh, no, I'm not buying into that anymore, that's resistance. I'm buying into this reality. That's resistance. And that's the kind of resistance that really does inoculate you against the racism, inoculate you against the so-called microaggressions or macroaggressions, where you can just be going for a jog in a community and people get in a truck and follow you and shoot you dead. And no, we can't allow that kind of behavior to shape and shift our consciousness, because then we move from not a place of love, which is the design and intention, we move from a place of fear, which is stifling. So we have to demonstrate resistance, and we have to also stop allowing people to blame the victim. We want, society wants to make us responsible for our poverty, our poor health outcomes, our poor educational outcomes, our poor political our outcomes. Those may exist, but they exist by design by people other than ourselves and a few others who look like us who've been co-opted to support that system. No, we are not to be blamed for what someone else has created and tried to impose on us. We may be victimized, but we're not victims. There's a difference. You can victimize me from sun up till sundown. Doesn't make me a victim, makes me victimized and makes you the victimizer. So we have to change our language and our thinking in concert with what is the true reality from an optimal conceptual system. We have to quit giving power to people who don't deserve it, have never demonstrated from a cultural frame of reference that they're capable of handling it, and have at every turn led us to destruction, be it environmental, economic. I mean, the warmongering is just never stopped with this cultural group. So we need reparations, but we have to make sure they're reparations from our cultural frame, not theirs, because they're really, really good, that suboptimal fragmented view, people who adopt it, are really good at thinking about, now, how can I do something for these people to make them think I've given them something or this is helpful to them, when indeed it's really benefiting me more than anybody else. It will never really benefit them. So critical thinking, deep thinking is essential as we pursue self-knowledge, as we pursue moral reasoning and ethical standards. We've got to learn to think critically, we've got to learn to think deeply, and we've got to quit allowing people to define reality for us that's not in our best interest. 400 years of someone else defining a reality that's not been in our best interest is really quite long enough. But that's going to continue as long as we use their belief system, their conceptual system, their assumptions about the world and the way things are. We're bound to be victimized.
You know, I want to take off with a couple of things you said, both in terms of being a victim. You know, being a victim is something that you accept, and you'll only accept that when you stop resisting. And I think resistance is important. And as you mentioned, the way to resist is to develop or to get rid of this mindset and develop an understanding of yourself in terms of self-knowledge and in terms of identity that goes back to the original understanding of who we are as human beings and relationship with the environment. And, you know, if we look at our revolution, shall we say, coming out of slavery, you know, back in the 20s and my dad's time in Harlem and so on, they were all talking about the new Negro. The new Negro that was no longer a slave, the new Negro that no longer had to bow and say, yes, master, and no master, and go on and do master's bidding. This was the new Negro that was self-reliant, standing on his own two feet, you know, wanting his own piece of land so that he could work for the land and take care of his family and build community. And you know, as you go forward in terms of our revolutionary stance, development of pan-Africanism as a concept, you find Kwame Nkrumah saying very much the same thing, talking about the African personality, meaning that you have to have this identity of being African in order for pan-Africanism to be a reality. And this is really what we're talking about. You can have, you know, the physical revolution. Let's say that was the emancipation of slavery, or you can have another revolution, which says that you're now free from colonialism, and you're a nation with a flag, etc., etc. But unless you change your mind and we're no longer had a colonial mentality or a slave mentality, then all you're going to do is repeat the patterns of your slave master and your colonial master, and you end up in neocolonialism. And this is on a socio-political economic phase. Of course, we're talking about the psychological individual phase. But two things are one, because society is made up of individuals, and any political party or movement is made up of individuals. So there has to be an individual transformation of mind. And really, this is what is of extreme importance, because unless we do that, we're always going to have leaders, if you will, people of prominence, who have been trained and educated to use the technology of our oppressor. They're educated in the philosophy and the economics and if the ideologies of the oppressor, the religion of the oppressor, and they're the ones that are going to be representing us and making sure that we line up behind the systems and use the systems that the oppressor designs for us to use. And as we've been saying, time and again, these systems are not viable, they're not sustainable, and they have all these internal flaws. Even the super rich, the 1%, they're flawed people, because they have a lot of money or a lot of things that doesn't make them better human beings or more complete human beings. It just make them greedy human beings who are more attached to things and have more desires and anxieties, etc., because of their possessions. So this is of extreme importance at whatever level you look at it at, from the religious and or spiritual, from the economic and from the national, and of course from the individual in terms of our behavior and morals and values. And so it's of extreme importance that we understand this up and down the line. It's not a luxury, to talk about optimal psychology and a better method of behavior that is more suitable in terms of civilized living, based on cooperation and based on harmony and based on social justice and equity and so on. And those are not luxuries, those are necessities. And those are natural processes that are built into who we are as human beings. And it's important for us to identify with that, as opposed to continuing something that was an aberration for 2,000 years and took over the world in the last 400 years. So this whole conceptual framework is of extreme importance to normalize the world and to bring about a new paradigm. And of course, I call the new paradigm African humanism. But of course, it's not a new paradigm, it's still a paradigm of our ancestors, as opposed to, scientific materialism, which doesn't value the human at all, only values technology and industrial production, as opposed to, the individual, maybe the human being, not per se. They see the individual only in terms of mind body as somebody who uses commodities or makes commodities. So it's no different from a machine. So the human has been mechanized within that system. And that's why you have so much focus on IT and robotics and so on and so forth. I mean, if you go to a company, you've got a product and you don't like the product, you have a hard time getting a human being. If you get a human being, maybe in or somebody like that is going to talk to you and they're talking to you based on an algorithm on people. You get no human satisfaction because you're not really dealing with a human, you're really dealing with a machine or somebody who's been mechanized. So, the world is going in the wrong direction, and we have to civilize it, we have to humanize it. And the business of civilizing people is really humanizing them within the society. And the only way to do it is to be what we're talking about. The optimal psychologists. Well, it has to begin with the self-knowledge, and we need to get into that. I don't think that we're going to have that much time to start it this week. But I think we need to get into that whole concept of self-knowledge, which I think is the last chapter in your book. Because as you know, self-knowledge is the basis of all knowledge. And we have to start there, because if we don't know who we are, then we're really wasting our time in terms of living, that somebody else is defining us, or we're living a life of somebody else, not ourselves. And the purpose of us being here is to live our life as we are, what we came to manifest. And that's the only way we can have meaning in terms of our life. So we definitely have to stick to that whole business of self-knowledge.
Absolutely true, because we are here expressing as a self with unique gifts and talents and contributions to make, not just to ourselves, but to the greater good of the whole. Our ancestors understood it's really not about a self that's just an individual form that's born and dies and makes monuments to itself, hopefully, so people will remember them. It's about that self that's an expression of a divine and holy oneness that's actually in all human beings. And when we come to realize that, we entertain ourselves as a multidimensional self, a self that's connected to those who came before, those who will come after, all of nature, the entire community. That multidimensional self is the true net self. And the knowledge of that multidimensional self is really the kind of self-knowledge that is going to be allowing us to achieve truly sustainable well-being. And as we move in that direction, as we move away from the cliff of destruction and really elevate our consciousness to what's true, what you find is that our ancestors were so correct. It's taken almost 4,000 years for the newbie culture to even begin to think about what our ancestors knew. In psychology, for example, Dr. Garvey, the Euro-Western people have what they now call positive psychology. So they're inching toward optimal psychology, but they're still on pause because they don't understand. It's not about making me happy, because the only thing that's really going to make me the happiest is if we're all happy, if we're all experiencing sustainable well-being. And in traditional culture, Zulus say, I see you, I see the divinity in you. And then the next question is, and how are the children? Our children are not well. Our children can never become well until we take our power back and begin to define reality in a way that will help them to heal and make them well. And in order to do that, as we keep saying in terms of self-knowledge, it has to begin with us. It's not out there until we go in here and be still and really interrogate who and what we really are and get in touch with that sense of peace and security and well-being that's sustainable, that love that is able to transform not only our lives, but elevate humanity. So absolutely, absolutely true, Dr. Garvey. We've got a lot of work to do, but it's good work and we know how to do it. So we're happy about that.
I look forward to our next discussion as we get deeper into self-knowledge, and actually where does psychology end in terms of understanding the mind, and then spirit begins, because when you have unconditioned mind, then it's dynamic spirit that is controlling what we call mind as well as body. So there's that space, and it was very interesting to explore that.
We can even move into the understanding of soul that our ancestors had, soul being that never-ending life, that energy that recycles. So, so happy you joined us in this conversation. Continue to join us next week, and we will consider You so very welcome, and we appreciate you, and pursue self-knowledge. It's the only way. Peace and blessings.